Well, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Beverly. I've known her for quite a few years now, and we've worked together here and there on projects, and I've attended many of her workshops. I've been over to her Institute for Frontier Science many times, and I love going there. She has the most fantastic machines and equipment, and Beverly and Harry make a fabulous team on creating things. They have some systems there that are completely dark. They can measure photons, et cetera, et cetera. So I really think that research is impeccable. So I'm glad that she's here to talk about some very exciting things on the EMF side, which is something that we all got to be very, very much aware of, and she'll let you know. In addition, basically, she's on the board for a number on the board for the Journal of Alternative and Complementary Medicine, the Evidence-Based Integrative Medicine, and the Journal of Vortex Science and Technology. And she's also the professor at Energy Medicine University and the adjunct professor at the California Institute of Integral Science and the Saybrook University. And she's also a consultant for the industry on various maverick wellness products, and is a holistic health practitioner and advises clients on enhanced self-care. So she's a good person to know for many, many reasons. And her workshop tomorrow, Mary is taking the sign-ups for that in the back. And so her workshops are always very, very interesting. Be sure to attend if you can. And at the very end of the workshop, since there'll be groups that are interested in EMF, I just thought when the workshop is totally over, if anyone wants to stick around, I'll be happy to talk about biogeometry, so you know a little bit about that particular subject and how that interfaces with EMF. I'm just taking that as an opportunity, but totally after you're done. So, and with that, let me introduce Beverly. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Jerry. Well, it's really my pleasure to be here again. I've been part of this group, I think, since its inception 30-something years ago, and it's really great to see my old friends and colleagues. Really warms my heart. And to think this group survived and thrived, it's really fabulous because it does such fascinating work in the world. So, today I'm talking on a subject, and I got wired up with wireless just before, ironically enough, the wireless mic and an antenna running around my brain. I'm not sure what effect that's going to have on my performance here. And I know it's not a very popular subject in this part of the world because Silicon Valley invents and loves its toys. And here we are talking on cell phone radiation. So, first I'd like to begin telling you how prevalent the use is and the size of this problem. The Pew Research Center keeps track of how many cell phones there are. Some 7 billion cell phones worldwide in a world that's not quite 8 billion people. So you can see it's almost 1-to-1. And 5 billion of those cell phones are in developing countries. In the US, 90% of us have cell phones, and about 64% are smartphones. But that's last year's statistic, and it's probably already over 70%. And what's really frightening to me is that some 50% of the children worldwide are using cell phones. Because as you'll see in my talk, their skulls are very thin, much thinner than adults, and the radiation is very penetrating, much deeper into the brain than in adults. And this is something very much of concern because these are developing brains, and we know from oodles of biology that any developing organism has the most sensitivity to environmental fields. And so we don't know the results of that. We're really an experiment in the real world, and that really bothers me. And it's now the main personal communication device. And of course, it's not the only Wi-Fi device. There are many wireless devices, but today we're going to restrict it mainly to cell phones. And people often ask, well, are they safe? If you want to hear a good scientist talk about this, I highly recommend Dr. Barry Trower, a British physicist who worked on this problem for many years and is now retired. He has some illustrious videos where he really discusses the problem in depth. Here I only have a short time to discuss it, but let me say this. We have no safety standards. We only have guidelines, and the government admits to that, and worldwide governments admit to it. We don't really know what's safe for whom, and one has to consider the age of the person, whether they're pregnant or not, how many years of exposure, whether they're wearing the cell phone on the body or in a briefcase. We don't know our individual doses. There's one dosimeter in the world that I'm aware of, sold out of Germany, that costs about $3,000. I don't have one. I'd like to get one and begin to make studies on children and people in the world. So we don't even know our doses. It's impossible because it's also a dose that's highly fluctuating. Cell phones go through enormous bursts that are rather high intensity and then periods of quiet. And, you know, the average dose is what the industry has given voice to, but that's inadequate because biological systems are exquisitely sensitive to transients, to these widely fluctuating fields. We can't adapt to them, and there's nothing in the history of our evolution where we would run into such things. So we're an experiment. And of course, the smartphone has been around for not even 10 years. We forget that. It seems like we've had them forever. They're so useful and handy and do so many things. So we don't have data on long-term usage or exposure. So it's really a complex question. There's no consensus. The industry will tell you they're safe. I went to the Bioelectromagnetic Society meeting, the joint American-European, last summer, and most people there thought electrohypersensitivity was some psychological problem. They said it's only doing thermal things, heating, and it's a low dose. It's not heating your brain significantly, so there's no problem. And if people say there's a problem, they have a psychological problem. That was the mainstream view. I was pretty shocked that that's what they thought. There were a few people there, like Deborah Davis, who's well known for pursuing environmental issues, runs the Environmental Health Trust, who held a little symposium on possible hazards, and it was very poorly attended at the large scientific meeting that should be the conference on this subject. So I was very disappointed that there wasn't more interest or even taking the question seriously from colleagues in the industry and in academia who work in the field. So let's take a look at the history of wireless technology. It was 1992 when broadband first appeared, and then 1996 cell phones and cell phone towers got going, but they were cumbersome, large, etc., the cell phones. Not that popular yet. In 1998, that's just about 18 years ago, low orbit satellites blasting wireless radiation, and 2001 Wi-Fi. 2007, just 9 years ago, the smartphone appeared, and it seems like it's ubiquitous. Everybody's standing there, and that may be the worst thing, that society is now standing around and individuals glued to a little box. When I look around at my colleagues and see how out of touch they are with ordinary reality and nature around them, that may be the saddest consequence, actually, of these phones in our society. In terms of the electromagnetic spectrum, we're talking about the emission from cell phones is in this non-ionizing region of megahertz and gigahertz. And it was long thought that this non-ionizing radiation had no biological effects except for possible tissue heating at high intensities. But of course, there's a lot of papers that show there are non-thermal effects, just not done in the United States, most of them. And then we have the terahertz, which of course are the big devices in homeland security centers and airports. The body emits a lot of infrared energy, and out here we have the ionizing radiations, which are well known to have powerful biological effects. Of course, we can see visual light, visible light there, and then ultraviolet X-rays, gamma rays, etc., are used in medicine. They're strong ionizing rays. They kill tissue. They image skeletons, etc. But personally, everyone thought there was really no action in biology down here. But now it's coming clear that there's a lot more than we had anticipated. And yet we have these technologies already grown up all around us. So not only do we have cell phones and cell phone towers to be concerned with, but Wi-Fi modems and radar and a plethora of other technologies emitting in this non-ionizing zone. So I'm talking about cell phone radiation, but the problem is really more complex. And tomorrow at our workshop we'll go into more details and even measure your devices if you bring them. It will be exciting. Harry brought a lot of equipment. The car is absolutely jammed full of frequency generators and analyzers and oscilloscopes, and we're going to have fun. So, in terms of the guidelines, again, they're not safety, but the guidelines, governmental guidelines, which, by the way, are interestingly determined by what the industry tells the government. There is very little third-party research on this topic. It's been largely funded by the industry. And then, of course, in the literature, one can clearly distinguish between papers funded by the industry and government or third-party papers, and they don't get the same results. In other words, there's an inherent bias in the papers that were funded by the industry, which is clear if you analyze the literature according to funder. So that's something to be concerned about. And there's virtually no funding for third parties to take a look at this. It's very difficult to find grants, and certainly government grants as well. The government just bends over and says yes to industry. Whatever industry wants, industry gets in terms of guidelines. And recently I heard that the industry convinced the government that the ear is really an appendage and can take even more radiation. So now they're going to up the wattage that's permitted in the next generation cell phones. You know, like the hand is an appendage, but the ear, of course, is very close to your head. Well, that's how it is. The government says yes when industry makes a comment. So we have only guidelines based on SAR, as it's called, and that's based on heating effects. The non-thermal effects are not taken into account. Now, it's interesting that in Russia, the guidelines for exposure are 100 times lower than in the United States. And in Austria, the guidelines for exposure are 1,000 times lower than in the United States. And yet, I was in Austria, and I wasn't really using my cell phone, but it was connecting to the satellites, etc., in the cells. And when I went over the border from Germany to Austria, sure enough, it told me now I'm entering Austria. So our cell phones work fine with less power. Why do we have this enormous jolt in the United States compared to other parts of the world? It's interesting. I'm not sure why. I've asked that question. They say, well, it's a big country. so they made cell phone towers have more power. But I think it's the American way. Bigger is better, and so they just made them stronger. We don't necessarily need them stronger. The signals work fine. So the official view on safety is that these radio waves, they're really microwaves in the case of the cell phones, they have biological effects only if intense enough to cook tissue, just like putting food in a microwave. That's a specific frequency, though, that heats water. But it's not too far away from that where cell phones operate. Now, cell phone radiation is not cooking tissue. You may feel a little warmth around your ear if you're holding the phone there. And I remember once a video on the internet that had a bunch of cell phones and some popcorn kernels, and suddenly the popcorn kernels came into popcorn. And one wondered, well, if you just point that many cell phones, are you heating up the popcorn? But it was really a bogus video. It is not heating up the popcorn, so that's not an issue. And the specific absorption rate, it's, again, this is the guideline. In the United States, it's not to exceed 1.6 watts per kilogram. But the problem is that's an average. And cell phones are not putting out some continuous band, but rather enormous jumps, and then still points and more enormous jumps. And you're going to see that maybe for the first time, and you'll never forget when you see what your own device does with Harry's equipment tomorrow. So come and join us. But even then, on the FDA and the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission websites, I'm quoting them, there is no proof that wireless phones are completely safe. So they admit it. So here is a thermographic image before using the cell phone and afterwards. Of course, this is superficial. Thermography doesn't really look at deep tissue. It's looking at blood flow. And someone's holding a cell phone to the head. There's heating, but is it going deeply into the brain? No. And when they measure this, they use a mannequin. They use what looks like a head and shoulders, let's say made of plastic. It's a dummy, stuffed with physiological saline, a solution of salt water. And they have some thermistor down there, deep in the brain, what would be the area of the brain, looking for any heating effect. That's how it's measured. That's the official measurement of SAR. But so what we see here is just superficial. People often show these things, and it's not that important. But here's something, absorption in the brain according to age, and this relates to the thin skulls of 5-year-olds, even 10-year-olds, and the adult. You know, the 0.5 millimeter thin skull of a child allows more radiation to pass into the brain. So this is not, I'm not showing you a heating effect here. I'm showing you the penetration of what would be significant levels of radiation. And we should be concerned about this, not only for the adult, but for the children. And the children, of course, are given these often as toys, or in schools they have iPads and things, and commercial level Wi-Fi all over the schools. So the skull thickness of a child, 0.5 millimeter compared to an adult at 2 millimeters, can take the same radiation will penetrate, giving 4.49 watts per kilogram to the child, but only 2.93 watts per kilogram to the adult. So it's significantly differently. And we need to worry about this. Another thing is, and especially in children again, is the opening of the blood-brain barrier. This means that cells become permeable that normally don't allow certain things to penetrate into the brain. There's a barrier between the blood and the brain that's intact, except when microwave radiation comes, that barrier is violated, and then substances can get in the brain that normally never got in the brain. And this could cause, well, some of the syndromes we see. We wonder about attention deficit disorder and the many maladies of our time. I'm not saying it's due to this, but it may be a contributing factor. I heard that it takes, for a child who's making a 5 or 10 minute cell phone call, it takes something like 10 or 15 minutes for that brain to return to normal in terms of this blood-brain barrier function getting disturbed. Now, something that we all should pay attention to is distance, because the electromagnetics with respect to distance decays as 1 over r squared, so it's a hyperbola function. And if you just go a short distance from the source, you reduce the energy field enormously. Now, how many people have ever read the manual on their cell phones? Did you know there was a manual? They don't hand you a manual, except now in Berkeley. Berkeley passed a law that mandates cell phone manufacturers to hand a paper copy of the manual if you buy your cell phone in Berkeley. Berkeley made this law last year, and guess what? The industry sued Berkeley. Berkeley's going through enormous lawsuits just to hand out a paper manual so people know what to do with their cell phones. Because in the manual, it will tell you, don't touch that cell phone when it's actively communicating. Keep at least a distance of 1 inch, or 2.5 centimeters. And so if you did that, you would get so much less radiation. But there's a lot of people who are hanging onto it, clinging, sticking it in their bras or their pants pocket, even when it's on and receptive to a call or text. So again, distance is key. So again, the US guidelines are based on heating, and they don't consider what we call non-thermal effects that go beyond heating. There's a slew of effects, from behavior and performance all the way down to genetic and biochemical changes. And most of these studies were not done in the United States. They were done abroad in India, Eastern Europe, Russia. There's just not that much interest here, I think, because the industry has so convinced everyone it's all about heating. And that's why over there they have such reduced guidelines for exposure compared to the US. So I found some 200 research papers in doing a recent literature review on this subject. And the behavioral effects, performance effects, effects on organs, tissues, effects at every level of biological organization, down to the molecular and genetic level. In terms of gene expression, whether that's in fruit flies, in mice, or people. Changes in brain blood flow and the blood-brain barrier, as I said. There are studies showing decreased sperm count, viability, and motility, especially when men put the phone here or here, close to the gonads. And an interesting thing is that sometimes a less intense field has a stronger biological effect. But that's a paradox in bioelectromagnetics, and it's called a window effect. There are specific regions of frequency, intensity, etc., that are biologically active, and we don't have a good theory for this. No one really knows why, but they're observations. And much of this is also hard to replicate, so it may depend on past history of the organism or the phase of the moon or other confounding variables that we don't fully understand. And so there's a lot of disparate data. Sometimes it's not fully reported, and it's really hard to make sense of this literature. But it's inarguable that there are non-thermal effects. They're well documented, and even in the English language. So now, the World Health Organization has stated clearly that the Wi-Fi, the cell phone radiation in particular, is a weak carcinogen, category 2B, of the same order as caffeine. Lots of people don't worry about that. They drink tons of caffeine, right? But brain cancer, glioma, much more serious, and acoustic neuroma, a tumor that we never saw until cell phones were born and people were using them a lot. So I'd say we don't have sufficient time for many of these tumors to have appeared yet, but we do have an increased incidence of brain cancer, even in the last decade. And then we have not just exposure to cell phone radiation, but Wi-Fi from the modems. We have cell phone tower exposures, and there's increasing numbers of these popping up all over. And DECT phones, the cordless phones in the home, which are sometimes constant emitters. And that's a problem. They may be emitting even more than your cell phone. And nobody's paying attention to this either. There's a syndrome that World Health Organization elucidated and called electrohypersensitivity. And they estimated in 2011 that it affected between 3 and 6% of the world population, and that number is growing. And many people have some symptoms, whether it's ringing in the ears or headaches or fatigue or heart palpitations, sleep problems. These are some of the symptoms. And some people are really much more debilitated. When smart meters came out several years ago in California, I suddenly had a slew of health clients. And they didn't know what hit them. They couldn't sleep in their own homes. They were camping out, especially when the smartphones were close to the bedroom. Smartphones are also doing this the aperiodic transients and bursts of radio frequency. And now in California, we can, of course, get it reversed and go back to our analog meters. But there's been a plethora of health problems from these smart meters, as well as explosions. We had an explosion at our lab from some smart meters. So that's a reality, even though the industry doesn't recognize it. They think it's one of these, psychological problems, but there's a real syndrome. And so here's the statement that it is class 2B human carcinogen and increased evidence for brain cancer, acoustic neuroma. And the BlackBerry manual says, interestingly, to hold it, there is a warning in their manual. And it says, keep the BlackBerry device at least 0.98 inches from the body, especially when it is transmitting. But most people don't respect this. They don't read the manual, and they don't do it. So we all ought to take a look at that. Now I'm going to tell you about a study that I did. It's all about short-term exposure to cell phone radiation and the blood in particular, and also a little bit about the biofield, or the energy field of the body. So these were my research questions. Does the blood, as seen under a dark field microscope, change after human subjects are exposed to a smartphone for a short period of time. And the period of time was 45 minutes of wearing the phone in a backpack, and then followed by another 45 minutes of active use of the phone. And a secondary question was, does consuming a mostly, and this is the Weston A. Price diet. Weston A. Price was a dentist back in the 1940s and 50s who wondered about all the decay and crooked teeth in Americans' mouths and traveled the world looking at diet and mouth and teeth structure, and found the indigenous cultures had perfect teeth, straight, clean, didn't use a toothbrush, never saw a dentist, and discovered what they ate, and it's really more the diet of our ancestors. It's not processed food, it's pastured meats, and I have a list of things, but you'll see. So this study was funded by the Weston A. Price Foundation in Washington, D.C., and they were curious whether this diet might help prevent effects from cell phone radiation. So that was part of the study. And third question, is there an effect on the human biofield from short-term exposure to cell phone radiation? So it was an exploratory study, and it really was the first study that I know of on this subject. I had seen on the internet pictures of blood occasionally that people showed with stickiness from cell phone radiation, but nobody had made a controlled study showing exactly what happens over time, as I did in this study. So I took 10 healthy adults. They were varied in age from the 20s to age 75. There was no control group. It was an outcome study, so everyone was just looked at baseline and then after use of the phone, etc. And it was the same smartphone use throughout and network provider. So they came in and they had an initial blood test. If they weren't, if their blood was not good enough looking, I had to eliminate them from the study. But those who had reasonably good looking blood, and I'll show you what that looks like in a moment, were accepted in the study, as well as who consumed various percentages of this Weston A. Price diet. And then they wore the cell phone for 45 minutes in a backpack in readiness mode. It was turned on ready to receive a call, but it didn't receive any calls or texts, followed by another 45 minutes of active communication, which I'll describe. And the blood was taken from the fingertip or the toe and microphotographed, and the Biofield was assessed with the Biowell camera, which I can show you pictures of a little bit later. So subjects were between 27 and 75, a mean age of 53, 8 women, 2 men. And I asked them about their own cell phone habits. So 8 out of the 10 had a personal cell phone, 6 out of 8 had smartphones. So it was similar to statistics in the United States. 2 of them didn't own or use a cell phone. And in terms of those who did, daily use was between 0 and 3.5 hours with a mean of 1.2 hours per day. Overall use from 0 to 20 years with a mean of 10 years usage. Most were members of the Weston A. Price Foundation, and they consumed this diet of our ancestors to varying degrees. Here is that diet. No liquid oils except for unrefined olive oil, no refined sugars, no corn syrup, little or no pastured milk. They drank raw milk when they could find it, or ate raw cheese, or they didn't. Some of them didn't drink milk. Free-range eggs, grass-fed animal meat, wild fish, organic vegetables and fruits. And they had the idea, and this makes a lot of sense to me, that grains and nuts have toxins because, of course, plants don't want their seeds eaten. But if you soak them and discard that, then you get rid of those toxins. So the soaking and sprouting, essentially, of grains and nuts makes them more digestible and less toxic to us. And then a lot of saturated fat used in cooking, lard, butter, tallow, and coconut oil, quite a lot, 3 to 15 tablespoons a day. Mostly homemade meals with little restaurant food, and cod liver oil supplementation, which is an old-time thing, and fermented beverages and foods such as sauerkraut, yogurt, kefirs, and kombucha. So the study procedures, subjects came by appointment. They refrained from using any cell phone or DECT phone for 4 hours. They had to fast 5 hours prior to coming because to look at the blood, I wanted it clean without a lot of fat. And first they got a baseline blood test, and then they wore the cell phone in a backpack for 45 minutes in what I call the carrying condition. And finally, another 45 minutes of a phone communication. Actually, they called me. I was on a landline. And then they had, of that 45 minutes, 2 periods of 5 minutes each of the phone placed on the head, near the head. So 3 blood samples were then compared for each person, and I also looked at the Biofield, and I'll say more about that at the end. So the blood microscopy is dark field that I used. It's peripheral blood from fingertip or toe, and I evaluated because I'm a trained and have done this for 20 years, so I'm quite sophisticated, I would say, at scoring the blood in terms of a Likert scale, whether a certain element is present or not in the blood. Things like the stickiness of the red blood cells in aggregates, the shape of the red blood cells, the integrity or whether they're bursting, size variations, forming ghosts, white blood cell morphology, types, the movement of the white blood cells and the aggregation if present. Platelet aggregation in the plasma, that's another type of cell used in clotting. Fibrin formation, which is white threads that are in the blood clot. Presence of micromes, crystals, and other things. And finally, what I found was most important in the cell phone case was red blood cell aggregation and shape changes. So that's what I was scoring mainly. Those were the main changes, as you'll see. And so it's a visual examination and scoring, small droplets of blood, and it's a measure of what we call the biological terrain. So it's the soil of the body in which all of our cells live and thrive. Hopefully, if the soil is clean and rich, then the cells will do well. And if it's polluted or has a high viscosity or is full of problems, then the cells are not well nourished. I should say that this type of blood test is not an official medical test in the clinic, but it provides useful information and is often an adjunct test done by holistic practitioners, and certainly is a viable research method. It's also a diagnostic method for early Lyme disease and syphilis. And in fact, we did a study on Lyme disease and live blood with FMVR some years ago, which was very interesting. So what does it show? I'm going to show you that the setup is here with a microscope, a video camera, which is actually analog, but I've converted it to digital, and then one looks at the screen, takes photos and videos. So person pricks their finger with a standard sterile lancet. And this is ideal blood. Now, with dark field, the blood is lit from the sides, so it appears that the edges of the cells are seen. What's good about this blood is that the red blood cells are all separated. They're about the same size, which means that there's a good diet because you make about 3 million new red cells every day. The diet is regular, and the spaces between the red blood cells are where the plasma is, and they're clean. No sign of fibrin or microbes or anything else. So that's ideal blood, but extremely rare. Here's a white blood cell in the act of movement and toward this direction, just caught in the act. And that's how the blood of someone eating this diet, by the way, looks. And in general, people's diets make their blood quite sticky. I think genetically modified foods and processed foods of all kinds, plus fats that are corrupt, often industrial, extracted with solvents, etc. So we end up with blood that's quite sticky, and that doesn't travel very well in the tiniest capillaries throughout the body. So there's often low energy or brain fog or many complaints with blood like this in the clinic. So now I'm going to show you the results. I already showed that. Let's see. Let me show you 4 cases, and I'm showing you the elder cases from age 55 to 75, because as it turns out, they were the strongest reactors to the cell phone radiation. 9 out of 10 showed some reaction in the blood, but it was more apparent with the elder group. So this is a subject, female, age 57 at baseline. Her blood looks pretty good. There's a little bit of debris in the plasma, but the cells are separated. Post-carrying, the blood already changed. You can see the stickiness of the cells piling up on one another. And the cells should repel one another because they have a net negative charge called the zeta potential. So something was lost in that charge on the cells. After using the phone 45 minutes, so that's an additional 45 minutes, now we see misshapen cells. They're no longer round and quite sticky. And so this is not a very good picture. This looks like an inflamed condition. The biochemistry of inflammation would show this in someone eating, for example, foods that are causing some innate inflammatory process. Let's go on to the second subject. This is a 55-year-old woman. And there's a little bit of stickiness in the baseline of this blood, but it's not terribly bad. After carrying the phone, the stickiness increased, as shown here. And after active phone use, the cells were all balled up in what we call rouleaux, kind of stacks of coins, big conglomerates, and there was also some fibrin. So it was early clotting. And again, when we see early clotting, we know that the biochemical process of inflammation has been turned on, because inflammation and clotting go hand in hand, especially when they show up very early in the blood. So there's some inflammatory process then that is resulting apparently from the cell phone radiation. This same subject volunteered also blood from the toe, because it could be argued, well, I'm measuring blood from the finger that held the cell phone. And is it just local or is it systemic? But measuring it from the toe suggests that it is systemic, and I would expect that because the blood is circulating. But indeed, the blood is still quite stuck together, as far away from the finger as you can imagine. This is the third subject, 75 years old. Her blood doesn't look quite as good as the others, but there is an aging factor too with the blood. A little bit more stickiness to start with and a small amount of fibrin. In baseline, carrying condition, the cells are quite stuck together in rouleaux, as shown here. Very few single cells. And I found something interesting in the post-use condition that became apparent with her. And you start to see these red blood cells with spikes on them. I can only focus on that. It looks like a little bump, but actually, if you focus in depth, you can see that it's a spiky cell, and it's called an echinocyte. Echinocytes, that word comes from echinoderm, and that's the category for the sea urchins that have those spikes all over their body. So that's what happened to these cells, and the cells literally gave up their shape, so their membranes have been disturbed. And there's actually a literature that shows microwaves will change cell membrane permeability, so I'm not surprised. And now I think that maybe in the first case, the cells earlier on were hugging each other, maybe trying to preserve their shape, and then they let go, and then the shape change occurred. Echinocytes are, we don't know how reversible that is. I know that the sticky cell is somewhat reversible, but this is another question, because this is a known pathological cell in hematology. This is the fourth subject, and this is in the baseline condition. This is a male, 55. Cells look pretty separate. Post-carrying condition, cells became sticky and overlapped quite a bit. And in the post-use condition, almost 100% of the cells are echinocytes, are the spiky red blood cells. And this is as soon as I can focus on the sample. So that's a rather dramatic change. Now we look to see across the 10 subjects whether they're plotted according to the percent of Weston A. Price diet from 20% up to about 98, whether net red blood cell aggregates and net red blood cell shape changes had any relationship with this percentage, but as you can see, there's no apparent relationship. Now it's a small sample, but of 10 subjects, but I don't see any tendency for any relationship here. So it seems clear that diet, at least from this small sample, has no protective effect. And in fact, the literature does not talk about any protective effect from any interaction of diet with electromagnetic pollution. It's just not there. So there's no way you can eat something better to protect yourself, in other words. Now this is in the post-use condition. The prior slide was in the post-carrying condition. But again here, there's no clear relationship to the diet and the percent of that Weston A. Price diet. It was also estimated by the subjects, so that's somewhat a risky parameter to analyze when it's self-analyzed. Okay, then I looked at age, And there was definitely a relationship with age. As you can see, there was more stickiness and more shape changes going from 27 to 75. And I showed you the results of the last several subjects except for age 63. I showed you those subjects, and they did have more changes in aggregation in the post-carrying condition. And in the post-use condition, again, the elderly group had more changes in shape of the red blood cells, with moving to that echinocyte from a rippled cell to an echinocyte, a spiky cell. So this is a summary of the 10 subjects on the left in the carrying condition. There were more aggregations of red blood cells and less shape changes, and in the use condition, aggregation went down slightly, but the membrane changes showed up more dramatically. So it suggests that, and these were rather ordinary periods of use, 45 minutes on the body, 45 minutes of active use, is not an extraordinary amount of time. So in conclusion, short-term human exposure to cell phone radiation just in ordinary use of an hour or two a day can lead to undesirable changes in the blood. 9 out of 10 subjects showed such undesirable changes. And first, it seems that cells aggregate, then they became misshapen and spiky. And I already mentioned the zeta potential. This is something inherent in all the red blood cells. Has to do with phospholipids on the outside that form this net negative charge, in which case they should be repelling one another, as like charges do repel. So something has occurred to the membranes. That seems clear in terms of changing charge and possibly permeability, especially when the membranes change shape. So I'd like to discuss some of these observations. We see this kind of red blood cell aggregation in the elderly quite a lot, and in those eating pro-inflammatory diets, fast food, and even, I would say, even the organic diet of processed foods, because there's still a lot of corrupt food in processed foods, even if they're organic. And when we have this kind of blood that's aggregated, we have decreased microcirculation and increased blood viscosity, which makes it harder for the heart to pump the blood. And of course, the flow of the blood is impaired, especially in the microcirculation. So there's an increased cardiovascular risk. And cardiovascular illness is the #1 illness of our world. So it's something to be concerned about, that this is producing such an effect. There may also be calcium efflux from these cells. There's a literature that says low-level microwaves are associated with calcium coming out of the cell. And the spiky and misshapen shells are associated with diseases like cirrhosis of the liver, which is a serious death of the liver. And I'm not sure how reversible that is. I could not find a literature on that. So we know that the echinocytes, the spiky cells, would give less oxygen. They would be less apt to bring oxygen and take away carbon dioxide. So there are issues with red blood cells performing their job with this shape change. And we don't know how long all these changes last. People ask me, well, why didn't I follow up on these subjects? Because they already were in the laboratory about 3 hours, and they came in fasted for 5 hours. So they were already fasted for 8 hours. And I absolutely had to let them go home and eat. And in which case, then the food would affect the blood. So there's only so long you can study subjects, and we have to think cleverly how we would look for an effect and then look for how long the effect would last in subsequent studies, but we didn't know that from this study. I was just looking for an effect, and I have to tell you, I wasn't expecting necessarily an effect on the blood, other than stickiness, because I had seen that. But I was not expecting echinocytes or membranes that were disrupted. Now we also had the older subjects who used cell phones generally less, had more unhealthy blood changes than younger subjects. Now why is this? In part it may do that they have less resilience than the younger people, or it's also possible that there's a factor of adaptation to the microwaves. In which case, more use, you have possible a level of adaptation, but we don't know. That kind of study, to take a look at that, would take a lot more subjects and more time. So this study was limited, but it did show an effect. It was small and short term. There wasn't a control group. There wasn't blinding. They were all single sessions, and it was just to look for an effect. And yet, it's still a study that we know what the cell phone treatment was identical. They sat in the same place in the room. They made a phone call to me, etc. All the timings were appropriate. And I have a lot of experience looking at blood for 20 years. And by the way, having looked at blood for 20 years, I can tell you that blood in general is getting worse, not better. Now, we have many onslaughts to our health at this time. We have more processed food, more genetically modified organisms, more radiation, ambient, etc. So I would say, it's hard to say what are causal factors. There are many factors, but clearly, to me, I see almost no one with good-looking blood anymore out there. It's extremely rare. It's like 1%. So I published this paper. You can find it online. WestonAPrice.org, if you just go there and then look up cell phone radiation, you'll find it. You don't have to write that all down. It's pretty easy to find on that website. So this was a very good website about this problem, electromagnetic-health.org, run by Camilla Reese. And she read my study and said it's the first study of this type that she knew of that shows that carrying a cell phone in the active condition of ready to receive a call or text causes a problem, causes some unhealthy changes. So it may well be the first study of its kind in that regard. I gave a paper on this at the Bioelectromagnetic Society. It was actually a poster, and this is the poster more or less. You can't read it, but I just put this in here, and I wanted to tell you the how shall I say it, the response to this paper. It was surprisingly non-existent. People weren't that interested in it, and they said, had I showed a disease condition, they would be all over it. The industry would be very concerned about a disease that would come about as a result of a cell phone. But the fact that there are blood changes, and what do they mean, they don't know and they don't care. So that was the net result of presenting at this conference. Much to my amazement. There was certainly discussion in the session on electrohypersensitivity and my research, but in general, lots of people left during that session. The conference got very scanty as all the industrial folks left. So, well, cell phone safety is questionable. The study just contributes one more bit of knowledge to a small but growing body of literature that indicates possible health issues that we don't really fully understand. But we need more studies by independent labs because we have mostly studies by the industry, and as I said, they are clearly biased if you look at them compared to the third-party studies, and that's a problem. And that's not surprising. That's the politics of big business science. But I'm using now this method that I developed in the study as a kind of a bioassay. What does that mean? Well, the same people who reacted heavily to cell phone radiation have been utilized in further studies to look for protective effects. So that's what I've been doing in the last few months, and I've tested 6 devices or strategies to reduce the problem, and I'm going to talk about that tomorrow. But I have to say this, in general, there's more and more of these so-called protective devices in the market, from some little sticker you put on the backside of your phone, to pendants you wear around your neck, to devices you put in the room that are supposed to clear the room of whatever. And many of them are marketed without any adequate study. I don't often see any science, even though they say they've got science, they don't show it. And they certainly don't have peer-reviewed studies. That's a problem. So I studied 6 devices as an independent lab, and I'll talk about that tomorrow. And I want to tell you now a little bit about Biowell and what we found about the Biofield with these same people, same study. And the Biowell is a device based on the gas discharge visualization method. It's a form of high voltage electrophotography. It's very akin to Kirlian photography, developed by Dr. Konstantin Korotkov, a Russian physicist, who also developed the GDV camera, which I've used for many years. That's now about 20 years ago. Biowell came out about a year and a half ago. And it's a smaller USB-powered portable device with very easy-to-use software. And good for both research and clinic. Here's a picture of it. It's a little white cube with a hole to put your finger in and take a picture of it. So I just want to show you some of the post data, analyzed data. Now this was the woman, 75 years old. You know, this was baseline and I think post-use. You can't see differences really with that, but I know how this will look. Yeah. Okay, what I found is when people are holding the phone in one hand, and it's typical that you hold in the left and work with the right hand or take notes or whatever you do. People have a style of doing that, then the body seems to get imbalanced right-left in terms of energy distribution as we measure it with the Biowell. So this is, let me just say this. First we measure all 10 fingers for the induced light emission. It's a corona discharge that comes out of each fingertip as is put into the box. From that, there is a sector analysis of each finger that's done according to a large database in Russia where they correlated, for example, persons with thyroid disease and, say, index finger at a certain position relates to the thyroid. So they did all the footwork on thousands of people for many years, produced a database and then a software that's based on that empirical finding. So they have a sector analysis of all the fingers and an assignment to the various organs and tissues. So this one is based on the left hand and this one is based on the right hand. So these two were made prior to using the cell phone. She came in, and I can't say she has the best energy. It does bounce around. It is not an even distribution. Ideally, people would be in that central purple band up here, and or in the orange band, but not out here in the white, and certainly not in the deep pink band. So following cell phone use, this was her left hand and this is her right hand. This is just the 45 minutes. What we see is that the left side had much more energy. It was quite expanded but erratic. You can see the pattern of that red line is much more erratic than it was up here. And so that's the kind of changes we often saw following use of the cell phone, with typically holding it in one hand. And there's other software analysis of the fingers. Here it is for stress. Actually, stress did not show much change in this person, but right-left balance was the greatest change, from 97 to 85% right-left balance, same person. And it has also an assignment of the energies from the fingers into the chakras. These are the energy centers in the midline. And this is less scientific, I have to say, than just doing sector analysis and correlating with organs and populations of sick people. But it's interesting to look at nonetheless. So initially, she had this profile of the 7 chakras, and some of them are disturbed out in the left or right. It has to do with, again, right-left balance in particular. But after use of the phone, you can see that it's greatly disrupted in terms of left-right balance. So that seemed to be the bottom line, is that use of the phone disrupted right-left balance, as the phone is held in one hand. Another subject did not show quite such a strong response, but showed, this is before, after carrying, and after use, it showed the diminution in right-left balance. The other ones were not that significant. So I'd like to acknowledge Harry Jabs, who helped me with this study, Dr. Andre Laszlo, who is a professor of radiation biology at Washington University in St. Louis, an old friend and colleague of mine, Carl Merritt, who is a physician and I think a member of this group, who has done a lot of work on this subject, and the Weston A. Price Foundation for funding. And mention that I do individual holistic health consultations using these methods. If you're interested, I have some flyers over there. And also distribute the Biowell. And have a book that's a bit old, not on this subject, but on frontier science in general. And an appeal for donations to continue our studies. Weston A. Price Foundation, their main issue is diet. Of course, their mandate is mainly diet. They're looking at extraneous things and how they may be influenced, but as we didn't find an effect from their diet, there will be no more funding from the Weston A. Price Foundation. And that's how it goes. So we're seeking funding to continue this work and to find solutions, as well as to document more about these changes. I think if more people could see their blood on a screen and watch how their lifestyle affects it, people would change their habits. I've seen cigarette smokers take a look and watch their red blood cells burst like balloons in front of their own eyes from free radical reactions, and then take their cigarettes and just throw them away. Because it's really quite shocking to see how your cells are impacted by your own lifestyle. So, there's my email if you'd like to contact me, and I left some flyers and the books, etc. So I'm happy to handle discussion and any questions or points that you'd like to bring up. Do we have a mic for that? No. Okay.
Research in that center, it's the same story with pharmaceuticals. The drug companies do the studies, they can, the ones that don't give a positive thing and just publish the ones that do, and then hardly anybody's doing independent research. And then the same thing is now happening with GMO stuff. They get studied by Monsanto and cans the studies that don't work, or they don't do the right study anyway. And then nobody else is doing them except anecdotally. And so GMOs get a pass that, oh, they're healthy until proven dangerous. And same thing is happening with cell phones.
Yeah, science has been highly politicized, hasn't it? And turned and twisted according to big business interests. Yes, that's very depressing. Do we need to move that mic around? People are raising their hands, but I'm not sure he's recording them.
I'm not sure it's on, but I do have one question first.
Okay.
And well, maybe more as a comment and a hypothesis. I noticed a rouleau formation that occurs. Okay, is this on?
Yeah.
I noticed a rouleau formation, and you're talking about the possibilities of calcium neutralizing the charges on the surface. Another hypothesis might be that if there are voltage-gated calcium channels on the red blood cells, it's well known now with Martin Paul's work that calcium is, the channels are open to calcium due to EMF. And by doing that, that may be bringing in the calciums to the surface of the cells, not just from the inside, but from the outside. And therefore, once you get the negative charge neutralized, then the cells will start sticking together, and you're really affecting the membrane. So this whole thing about voltage-gated channels, calcium channels, is, I think, the very, very important thing. And you might have an assay for that aspect of it if this proves to be the case. We can chat about it.
Yes.
That's a thought.
Yes, I think that's probably a very important hypothesis to test. Thanks.
Of your 10 samples, did you ever check the C-reactive protein of these people and compare it to the normal?
No, the study didn't go that far to look at conventional biochemical markers.
Right.
But that would be a good one. C-reactive protein goes up when there's inflammation. A bunch of things go up. All of that.
It would also give you a baseline as to where their inflammation level was.
That's true.
Prior to your doing this experiment.
Yes, I would love to do more and link some more conventional biochemical markers with this type of blood analysis. And again, where's the funding for studies like that? That's always an issue, because those tests are expensive, those laboratory tests, right?
Get Lauren back there.
I just wanted to point out that if I remember correctly, when I started reading about the biological effects of EMF, I found 1,000 pages, greater than that, many reports from the Department of Defense during the microwave era. And they clearly say in there, and they document biological effects. Now, maybe the language was a little wishy-washy, maybe it didn't say exactly, but they were in there. Most of the scientists said yes, most probably, and they had resonance frequencies and so forth. But that information is so buried that nobody bothers to look through 1,000 pages, and it's so. I just wanted to point that out, that it's actually there.
Yeah.
Nobody uses
Well,
it.
and it's been going on for decades, even back in the 50s or so. Radio sickness, and it's just been there a long time, and now brushed aside because we're in love with our little toys. They can't be harmful. They sell them. Everything is fine. Well, they sold cigarettes, and many people smoke, but these things are just handy. It's not like cigarettes. So we're not going to give up our toys, but there are strategies to reduce our dosage. And the evidence shows that it's cumulative, the dosage, and you can end up with problems after many years of exposure. Electrohypersensitivity syndromes and maybe onto cancer. So that's what we're facing, especially with young populations that are really, well, as Jim and I were talking about addiction. I mean, the possibility of people are so reliant on these devices, so infatuated with them, and if not downright addicted to them. I don't know if they're addicted to the frequencies, that's another issue. But they're addicted to the convenience and the handiness and the fast information and communications. So without them, they seem crippled. So, yeah.
Do you view smartphones as more of a problem, the old style flip phones?
Yes, I suppose, because first of all, with the old style flip phone didn't do too much. All you did was make a phone call. Anything else was very cumbersome on the flip. But with the smartphone, because there's so many functions, you're using it more, and then it emits more. And the industry, with each generation of cell phone, for example, I measured the iPhone 6, and I have an iPhone 5, and each time it goes up a generation, there's a little more power, and then they raise the limit in Washington. And they convince, as I said, the ear is now an appendage. It can take more radiation. I mean, where do you go from there? I don't know.
Yeah, just a few thoughts on a psychological level, because what I see is it's great that people can get on a cell phone and call their relative in France, or children have it as a device for safety. But to me, it's turning our society into such an insecure collective where people are losing touch with intimacy because they don't even face each other to have an argument. They're sending emails and texts, and it's absurd to walk into a restaurant and see 8 people sitting at a table and 5 of them are scratching on a cell phone.
Yeah.
They're not even talking to each other, for God's sakes. And there's always these jokey things on television or something where they show a person walking through a shopping mall and she's so transfixed on the phone, she walks right into a fountain and falls in.
Yes.
And I mean, we are becoming a more and more unconscious society on the other end. There's the end where it's, again, a great information device, helps safety, but we are losing something intimacy-wise. And these kids are walking around, they don't even know that a bird's flying by, or we're getting out of touch with nature too. So I see a lot of psychological problems with it.
I really agree with you, and I think that may be the worst problem from the cell phones, even worse than the problems that I'm showing you here, is the changes in our society. To everybody groping at a little box, unconscious and unaware of the now, the presence. I find it disturbing to see a world like that.
I just, for the first time, picked one up, and it was only so that I could call AAA. I leave it in the glove box. I refuse to use that cell phone to communicate unless there was an emergency. And people looked at me like, how could you have lived the last 15 years without a cell phone? I look at them and say, what did you do before they were here?
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Actually, Jim and I, we do not have a cellular phone, and people are angry at us. How come I cannot call you anytime I want? I said, listen, 10 years ago, I had an answering machine at home. It still works. And do you think that I'm at your hand and feet any moment of my day? That I am at your service all the time? Just call my answering machine, leave me an email, and I will answer when I come home. When I'm doing my things, I'm not available to you. I'm sorry, but it has always been the case. But Everywhere I go, you don't have a cellular phone? No, I'm sorry, I want to keep my brain. Wow, they are upset. They are upset. And the second thing is, in a classroom, people do not listen to the lectures anymore.
Yes.
So these young people who are paying a lot of money, in some cases, like in the private college or gym teachers, they do not look at the teacher. They do not look at each other. There is no eye-to-eye contact anymore. There is no personal interaction, so therefore there is no emotion experience. That is gone. And then they are like, you know, they're just on their machine. That's it. You cannot get information to them.
Yeah.
That's very
100%.
frightening.
And the GPS, you know, people do not know how to tell me how to get to their house. They know the major cross street. They do not know the other 3 right turns or left turns. It's crazy.
No, you said something very important, and that is when we don't make eye contact, we cannot have any empathy. The psychological studies show this. And when we only stare at a box and not into one another's eyes, we are not building empathy as a society. We are building isolation. Yeah.
Has there been a noted increase in brain cancer over the last 20 years?
I understand that the brain cancer rate has gone up, and in some cases it's related to where the cell phone, the side that the person put the cell phone on. There's one very amazing video online. If you look up lawyer, cell phone, and brain cancer, you'll probably find it. And he's a very articulate man. He's a lawyer, and he's had 3 cancers, not just one. He had a cancer in the hand that held the cell phone. He did all of his business on the cell phone. He had a cancer in the chest, near the pocket where he stored the cell phone. And finally, he got a glioblastoma in the brain. And in his 40s, he died. And so he's appealing. And because of his appeal to cities to at least get the manual out to people so they know not to touch the cell phone. And this is one reason Berkeley has passed a law, although now fighting the big business. It's quite an ordeal. But, you know, there are many cases like this where the tumor is in the shape of the antenna of the cell phone and where it was placed on the body. And what can you say to these things? So it's hard to say. You know, there's more cancer generally. There's so many onslaughts to our health. But opening up the blood-brain barrier also allows things to get in the brain that shouldn't be there. So, yeah.
Did you compensate for anything like the ambient EMFs, like
Yes.
the Faraday cage or anything like that?
I didn't use a Faraday cage, but I have no Wi-Fi in my laboratory, and they were always in the same place in the room. They were seated not far from my desk at a certain zone, and the ambient fields were measured. I do have a neighbor above, and, you know, the ambient fields weren't changing, at least in the times that I was working with the subjects.
Changing all the time. So I don't know, some kind of interference going there.
Yeah, we don't have Wi-Fi. Yeah, well, you know, I don't want Wi-Fi. Actually, don't even need it. I'm sitting at one workstation. I don't see the point. Jessica.
The old book, Body Electric, did you reference that, or do you have thoughts about that?
Robert Becker's book? Well,
The old, yeah.
yeah, I mean, that's a great book. It's a little old. Barbara Becker's no longer with us for some time. And I knew him well. I actually worked with him on a panel at the National Institutes of Health. And we wrote a report on bioelectromagnetic medicine. And he was quite worried about what has now come about in our world in terms of the radiation with all these frequencies. He was really concerned. He wouldn't even get in a landline telephone. He was worried about the effects of that, which are minuscule compared to these devices. And so he was really concerned about electromagnetic pollution. And if he were alive today, I'm sure he would be quite a vocal spokesperson against what has come about. Mike.
So one of the most famous lawyers that got cancer on the side he used his cell phone was the guy in the O.J. Simpson trial. Blanking his name right now, but he died. And Terrence McKenna died of glioblastoma, and he had early editions of the cell phone. He was one of the first ones that was really using it all the time, and he could afford to get one. and back then. So
And Elizabeth Targ, the daughter of Russell Targ, psychiatrist, did a lot of consultations. She was a psychiatrist, did a lot of consultations with the cell phone, and I understand it was also on that side of the head.
right. I was just thinking that we're starting to get more transparency in government nowadays because of Snowden and things like that. But it would seem, I mean, it's too logical for Congress to do it, but it would seem like if somebody could tell these industries like pharmacy and farming and agriculture and the cell phone industry or allied industries, that you have to take a certain amount of your profits and put them in a fund and then let some university professor, people who are apolitical and not tied into them,
Yes.
and then accept research grants and then grant them so the results will be published, positive or negative or neutral. And then we can get down to the what's causing this. But as long as they control the big bucks and just give it to Congress, you know.
Well, you're absolutely right, Mike.
The society has gotten so bad with the recession that 25 congressmen are not getting paid off by the government, by the corporations.
Wow. No, that's a very good idea, you know, but we can only hope that Congress will take action. To me, it seems like it's a hopeless situation, the Congress. So, yeah.
Remind everybody that the portable phones that you walk around in your house are actually just as bad or maybe even worse than your cell phone.
They are, the DECT phone, I mentioned that.
Yeah.
The DECT phones may be emitting all the time from what I read, even when they're not on, and even sitting in their base, that the base device is also emitting. People often have that right on the desk, you know, just a few feet from their body, and it's all the time. And the more recent ones have even higher power. You can take them further away from the base and still talk. So, well, go back to wired phones. It's, at least for now, but my understanding is, talking to AT&T, as we had them out repairing something at our home, the future of landlines is grim. Probably in 5 years, there will be no more landlines. Because their plan is, they say they can't manage repairs on them anymore. So they're going to put up a neighborhood antenna, and that will serve your so-called landline. And forget about wiring to the house, all of that. Yeah.
So you're talking a bit about how society views all this stuff and how people can actually be angry with you for not even having a cell phone. And a lot of people just don't know and don't want to know the truth of what's going on. So in that context, which we live today, which I hope changes, and we're all working to change that, but given that's where we live today, do you have any suggestions on how to approach, say, a neighbor? For example, I have a new neighbor that just moved in below me, and my bedroom, because I have meters, now has 1,000 times the amount of radiation it had 2 weeks ago before she moved in. And I want to approach her in some way, but I don't know how to approach this person. Do you have any suggestions? Because I get kind of one chance, and if I blow it, you know,
Well,
so do you have, maybe you know how to approach people, or you have some suggestions for how to bring it up with someone who might be like,
why don't you get hold of my study, it's online, and show her the blood changes. Show the person the blood changes. And say, here's what happens from this radiation. Just 45 minutes does this, and you've got that thing on all the time.
if I get to a point where she's open enough to look at something, I
Yeah.
have plenty to show her.
Okay.
My question is how to approach someone from the beginning of the conversation to have them even be open to looking at anything at all.
Start with
I think
concern
that's
for
a
her.
tough problem. I mean, a few years ago, Harry and I wanted to do a workshop in Silicon Valley on this subject, and it was the only thing in my life that was ever canceled for lack of participation, to tell you the truth. Because Silicon Valley is infatuated with its toys. It doesn't want to see the problems or hear it. And as long as people love these devices so much and, you know, rely on them, they're just not going to listen.
And her health.
Yeah, I always raise the concern of the family, but what you can do, I mean, you can put up some shielding. There is material that, you know, this is below you, it's a little different, but you could put up some shielding to block some of that in the form of Faraday cages. And
I have a couple different kinds of materials and one coming that I've been playing with.
And you might ask her if she could turn it off at night. Say that, you know, you'll have better quality sleep. will all have better quality sleep if you put your Wi-Fi on a timer. And so it goes off when you go to bed and it goes on when you're working. And that way, at least for 8 hours, you'll get some good rest.
If she's open to any kind of suggestion like that, I think it will go fine. My thing is like having approached people and have them go, they don't want to know. They don't want to know. They'll change the subject, they won't talk to you, they won't listen to you, they do not want to hear it, you know?
Yes.
And so then, you know, at that point you're kind of lost.
Well, you know, I remember the same was true about tobacco smoking. When there were a lot of smokers and you brought up the subject, they would get very upset and huffy and they don't want to talk about it and they just go smoking, you know. Anyway, and it totally turned, though, didn't it? It took a certain number of people who really said secondhand smoke is ruining our health. And look what smoking's doing to your lungs and your body. This is different, though, because there's so many perks with these technologies. It's different than an addiction. It's a different kind of addiction, I would say. Yeah.
Knowing that something is bad for you and you do it anyway. That's an addiction by my standard. So she's addicted because she doesn't want to hear.
Well, maybe, I don't know yet. I haven't approached her yet, so I don't know.
Yeah, okay.
I just feel like I have one shot, and if I blow it the first time, because, you know.
Get to know her first. Don't let that be your first initial contact.
No kids, then she'll be okay.
Yeah.
You mentioned the perks, but I think I heard of studies on the children's IQs are going up because they can Google for answers on their cell phones.
I heard just the opposite, that the IQ in general of the population has gone down about 5 or 10 points with each generation in recent decades. Yes. Well, I mean, I also have taught college for 30-something years. I mean, to me, I see the dumbing down. So I have a hard time believing that IQ goes up. I would say attention span is so low that people can't retain what the last sentence was, and then because of the way people are surfing and getting information and bombarded. Attention span is part of intelligence.
Seems like a big.
Well, they don't know anything more. They just know how to access it. I don't think that relates to IQ per se. I also find it disconcerting when a student in a classroom has a question for me. Instead of asking a question, they flip their cell phone and look it up to see what was the meaning of that word that I just said. That's what the kids do. Go ahead.
I wear this around my neck.
What is that?
It's an emergency call button.
Oh, yeah.
It also has a few PFs in it. I wear it next to my skin right here. Is that also bad? Do you know anything about it?
Well, I have never measured one of those, but come to our workshop and we'll have a zillion ways to measure that tomorrow.
What are the hours?
10, we'll probably go 3 hours at least, 10 to 1. Yeah, it'll probably be a little longer than we expected.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I've never measured, but I can tell you some other things like baby monitors. These are often digital and very bad because, again, the infant is most susceptible to the radiation, and it's every time, you know, it's communicating rather regularly with that big blip. So, but there are ways of getting analog baby monitors and other wired baby monitors. And the Wi-Fi baby monitors sold in the United States are much worse than those in Europe. Apparently they're blasting almost all the time. So, especially it's right near your heart. Yes. Well, we have to figure out what that is emitting. We'll take a look for you tomorrow. Yeah.
I know that you plan to cover this. I don't know if it's on. I guess not.
It's on.
Oh, okay. I know that you plan to cover this tomorrow, but for those of us who unfortunately can't make it tomorrow, can you give us just a wee bit of insight into whether any of these devices that are supposed to counteract the negative effects of cell phones, whether any of them work, and if so, what they might be?
Okay, they work to varying degrees, but I didn't find a single one of the 6 that works 100%. That's the
Does
short
that mean
answer. Some
100
are better than others, and I'm
Does-
going to discuss those in detail.
Does that mean 100% of the time or 100% in counteracting the negative effects?
Well, the negative effects that I measured were Biofield and blood. What I showed you. I used the same people that I showed you the blood of today, and I'm looking to see how is the blood preserved for these same people? Using those devices with the phone, same conditions, the experiment was identical. So there were 2 devices that looked pretty good, but it's not 100%, but I'm going to talk about those tomorrow. So I'll eventually write up a paper on this when I'm done analyzing all the data, but I am not sure where I'll publish it. But again, I mean, there's just so many devices. You start looking in the literature, new devices just show up here and there. And there are issues with the devices, some of which I'm not testing. One device I tested over a period of time and found out that it wore down. It worked good at the beginning, and 30 days later, it failed to work. And so told the inventor, what are you going to do about that? You know, you're selling a device for this amount of money, it works 30 days, but after the exposure, gone. So, I mean, again, the quality, the lifetime of the product is another issue that I'm not really studying. That study went on for a while, and that's how I discovered that inadvertently. But there are so many issues when you have products that claim to protect you that need to be addressed, and they have not been addressed. And so this is just the very beginning to look at those devices with third party. And I would say, I mean, there's just no funding out there. I haven't found any source to do it. So that's a problem.
I wonder, are we on? Okay. I wonder if you've looked into any of the data and research on smart meter effects. I've had one friend who had to move from an apartment,
Yeah.
and so affected her.
The smart meter is a very similar problem. The frequencies may be different. They're still in the radio frequency range, but the electrohypersensitivity to the smart meters, which again are on all the time with these high-powered peaks, interrupted by low points, and they said they were going to be on a few seconds a day. When we first heard about these meters, they said it's not a problem. It's going to send information to the power company at night or something. The problem is, where is it located with respect to where you live in your home most of the time? It may be outside, right near your head where you sleep. So I had clients like that. It was near the bedroom, and that's where the meter is. They couldn't sleep, they had pain. And I tested some of them. I had a cell phone, they were also sensitive to that. I would hold the phone in a way they would not know if it was on or off. And they would tell me when they had pain, and sure enough, it correlated with whether I turned the phone on or off, and they couldn't see. So I know that there's something there that's a serious health problem. And now in most states, they have given people the ability to go back to analog meters. We were one of the first states that got this, 7 years ago or so. And now I think the rollout is still continuing, but from our experience here, it seems to me it was one of the worst decisions ever made to produce a smart meter. What's it for? It's going to communicate with your smart appliances and give you more Wi-Fi bursts all the time. Oh yes, that too. That's worse. It's invasion of privacy. And you're supposed to know, well, then I can conserve more looking online. Oh, I had the washing machine on there, and and everybody knows whether you're home or not by the consumption. Yes. So this is not a good thing. No. And I think the Public Utility Commission got some payoff in order to pull this off. That was my understanding. Enormous rollout from, where is this coming from? Ultimately, the Agenda 21 of so-called building a sustainable New World Order. But it's all about big business and control, technocracy.
There was a little victory. They used to charge us $5 a month, and now it is free. There was a little victory that you can have your smart meter removed. We asked that right from the beginning, and the $5 a month penalty has been lifted.
Yes.
So you can, yes.
Yes.
So you don't pay for returning to your old system.
Yeah, we had to pay it for $10 a month for 3 years until they lifted it. Yes. It is free now. And other states are still getting the rollout as we speak. Yes. So it's, you know, it's going to be worldwide. It isn't just here in the United States. This is the new world order of technocracy, control, and spying, and all of that, as I see it. It's part of the surveillance, utter surveillance of every maneuver. Jim.
Tells you how many repeaters are in what town. Does anybody know that website?
I do at home. Yes, you can find.
I can send it to you.
There's like 1,800 repeaters in Mountain.
And they will tell you exactly where it is, how far from home and how intense they are.
Yes.
Maps.
There are maps of cell phone towers, that's right, but new ones are going up all the time. I would think the market is saturated. I recently saw one going up in my own neighborhood, and I couldn't imagine. It was right outside of a home. Why are they doing this? And just, you have no rights. You don't own this easement to your own properties. They can do anything they want with this easement. So we have to stand firm that we want Wi-Fi free places on Earth. Right now, my understanding is Google and some other large companies are going to put up more and more satellites and mini satellites, and there will be no Wi-Fi free place on Earth. That's the plan.
Yeah, I noticed in your practice that you do heart rate variability. Did you look at that at all with these people that you studied?
I did, and I haven't analyzed all of that yet. That was kind of an add-on I did on my own. And at that time, I had the kind of heart rate variability that needed a 5-minute interval that you plug on. But since then, I've purchased a different kind of heart rate variability that will enable me to show very subtle changes. For example, if I measure someone, and unknown to them, suppose I bring a cell phone near their body from behind. And then I can study how heart rate variability may change over different intervals of time. So I have a more sophisticated way of looking at real-time heart rate variability as a result of bringing EMFs near a person, even unknown to them. I think that's a better way to study it.
Will respond to HRV changes.
There are studies, there are a couple of studies on HRV that show unhealthy changes, more sympathetic activity over parasympathetic, and most people are already too skewed in that direction of stress. And the cell phone exacerbates it. But I think I need to show it in a way that it's less intrusive, then it would be a better study. So I'm hoping for a study of that type in the future.
Maybe I could make a statement. I've been writing a little bit about EMFs, and I think we're starting to get to the basis of what the problems are with EMF, if the writings of Martin Paul is in fact correct. And basically what he's saying is that there are calcium channels, voltage-gated calcium channels that allow calcium to get into cells. Getting calcium into cells is a bad thing unless it's regulated properly. And it can be therapeutic, but outside of the cell, in the plasma, it's 10,000 times as much calcium there as inside the cell. And if you get calcium inside the cell, things can happen. One thing that can happen is there's a process called apoptosis, and cells die, and that's initiated by calcium getting into the cells. But the other things that can happen is that, the therapeutic things that happen is that when you get calcium into cells, you can get nitric oxide formed, which can be a good thing in small doses. But if you get a lot of nitric oxide getting in, that's a bad thing. EMF, what that does is it turns on the voltage-gated calcium channels, so it's on all the time. or all the time when you're exposed to EMF, that means you're getting a lot of nitric oxide form. And when that happens, you get other things form. You get peroxynitrite. And peroxynitrite forms the free radicals, and those are the things that cause the damage. It's those free radicals that will cause DNA changes, and the DNA changes then will result in the cancers. It will result in the sperm decrease in counts. So all the things that one talks about can happen. And so we may be at the cusp of understanding all of this. And so there's some good work being done by a series of people right now. And we need assays. We need assays like Beverly is talking about. And it'd be great to sort of explore some of those assays that she's doing, because that's what the industry needs. They're not going to believe anything unless there's ways to do it, and they understand what's truly happening with EMF. It takes very, very little EMF to cause changes in the voltage-gated channels that occur. So it's not temperature; it's a biological effect. So.
Yeah.
I just wanted to get that concept out there so more people are aware of that concept. It is there, and we've got to start paying attention to it all.
Thank you, Jerry. And it's a very transient thing because these are like milliseconds or less. Some of these spikes, spikes in intensity of the RF, and so that can open, and then calcium redistributes wrong, because calcium is such an important regulator in the cell. It's one of the second messenger, big regulators. But I guess the mystery was, how could you get free radical increases from non-ionizing radiation? This was the puzzle. I know that there's a lot of these free radicals from radio waves, and I always said, it makes sense when you have ionizing radiation to get free radicals. You would expect it in the chemistry, but with non-ionizing radiation, it was a mystery. But you have hit the mechanism that I think shows us how that's the same problem as ionizing radiation. And both of them cause cancer and all these other problems. I'm talking about gamma rays, X-rays, and all that stuff. Yeah, Mike.
I just want to put in a plug for Beverly's doing the live cell analysis, because hospitals used to do live cell analysis. They would look in microscopes and watch what happens in the blood cells. But they found out they could process 100 slides in the time of dead cells in the time that you're spending looking at the live cells. So they're missing that whole part. And so for you to continue to do this, to show people what really happens, it's really useful. And I recommend people take you up on that. And the other thing is, was there a cell phone maker that sued you for actually promoting or unveiling the effects of cell phones, or can you even mention that without getting sued again?
No, I didn't mention which brand or type of cell phone I used deliberately. First of all, they're all pretty similar. They all work the same way. I just took one that I happen to have and used it in the same provider. So there was that consistency, but I'm not going to mention it because I don't want to single it out as the bad one. I don't think the others are any better. Well, they were seated. They had it in a backpack, and I put it in the inner pocket. So it was approximately about here. Of course, people have different geometries, but I used a backpack because everybody had pockets in a different place. So I tried to make something uniform in terms of carrying condition. But even then, they didn't touch that phone, and yet I was looking at blood from a finger. So it just shows you that the circulation of blood in general was changed. And then the toe blood, which I regularly took from that person in subsequent studies too, when it was improved from the devices, the protective devices, the toe blood was also improved. So that was gratifying to show that it seems to be a systemic effect or non-effect, one way or the other.
Beverly?
Yeah.
Ibrahim Kareem, when he was here, said that the cell phone companies are planning to have so much ambient EMF out there that the phones themselves would work without being charged. Were you aware of that? In other words, you won't have to charge them into the wall. They will get charged by the ambient.
I know about that. The local charger, Starbucks has it now. As a matter of fact, I wanted to go in and measure it. They said, you can't because everyone's stealing the little ring. But it's electromagnetic waves that are supposedly very powerful, but they're localized.
Well, he said it was going to be everywhere.
I never heard that.
Oh, he said it when he was here.
Wow.
When he spoke.
Really?
Yeah.
That's interesting. I recently learned of a cell phone that claims to run on the zero-point energy. It's online. I just got the website. I have to read this. Apparently it doesn't need charging, but it reminded me of what you were saying. It sounds controversial, but I'm going to follow up on it. I don't expect that to be any safer necessarily, but I would like to get a hold of one nonetheless and take a look. Yeah.
Just another question on the calcium channels. How does that actually affect calcium absorption into the bones?
No.
Does it affect it at all?
That's a different.
I think that's a different question. The assimilation of calcium into the bones and the efflux and influx of calcium voltage.
But if it's going into the cell, then it's not in the bloodstream.
Right.
Yeah, so it's getting into the cell. So it's a cell membrane phenomenon. So it's not a surface like a heat. It's a different.
I don't know. I think that's a very specific thing, osteogenesis and calcifications of bone. And that goes beyond just this little voltage channel of calcium. I don't think we have enough information to answer it. There's so much that's unknown in the cell biology. It's
I'm sorry, I'm a little bit off the subject, but I want to return to this because we have, a lot of us use electromagnetic frequencies such as Reich machine extensively for healing purposes. And now I am wondering what we've done to ourselves using Reich machine all the time. Because these electromagnetic frequencies, are they really harmful?
well, here's my suggestion, because I know we're never sure what Reich really did, and there are a lot of devices out there, some of which put out square waves, which are generating really many frequencies if you look at the Fourier analysis of that. But if you want, take our workshop, bring the device in. We'll measure it. I'd be delighted to find out what, if anything, are these things emitting.
We will. and same thing with a laser, the little handheld laser, because those are also infrared and so forth frequencies. And all the Reich frequencies are in that laser.
Ah. Interesting.
I should, some people are stepping.
Yeah, maybe it's time to.
Maybe if, yeah. Thank you, Beverly.
You're welcome.
Thank you.